Hello, I'm Kathy Rowan. I'm an Emerita Professor of Communication at George Mason University in Fairfax, Virginia. I'm honored to moderate a scientific session, the Communicating the Future, an agenda for engaging the public with basic science. This session explores evidence-based directions in scholarship, training, and practice to advance the impact of public engagement with basic science research. Thank you for joining us. This presentation is the third and final of 3 pre-recorded videos before our panelists come together live in February. In this video, Dr. Sara Yeo discusses 2 recent literature reviews in communication science or science communication and STEM fields and tells us some of the key findings and key questions. Later in this video, Sara and I will have a short discussion to dive deeper into the findings and the questions she shares. Sara, welcome.
Thank you, Kathy, and it's a pleasure to be here. So today I'm just going to talk a little bit about what Kathy said, a research agenda for understanding public engagement with basic research as opposed to applied research, which is probably why you're tuning into this session, right? So let's go ahead and dive right in. My Twitter handle is on my slides and my email is on there. Should you feel like you need to contact me, you're welcome to. So to start, I wanted to give you some context. Yeah, there's a little picture of Oahu here, but I wanted to give you some context about my positionality and where I'm coming from so that my comments about what a research agenda might look like are informed by this perspective. So I got my bachelor's degree in oceanography, actually, from a small liberal arts college, Hawaii Pacific University. From there, I majored in chemistry. I majored in oceanography. I minored in chemistry. I thought I was going to be a chemical oceanographer when I was an undergraduate student. I thought I was going to study carbon cycling in the world's oceans. I did go to graduate school in oceanography, but it turns out I was a microbial ecologist instead. So I studied microbiomes essentially in surface waters of the ocean. And from there, I thought, well, I'm going to do the same work, but I'm going to do it in a different place. Hawaii is much too nice. We're going to move to Wisconsin. And so off I went to Wisconsin as a PhD student in environmental engineering, studying very similar things, looking at microbes and microbial ecosystem dynamics in surface waters of lakes. There are lots of lakes in Wisconsin, but while I was there, I had started to do a lot of outreach in science. And I think microbial ecology to some extent is a lot of basic science, right? It's a lot of how do groups of microorganisms interact in my project in surface waters of the ocean. And so there's not a lot of kind of applied, immediately, obviously applied parts to this science. And so when I was doing outreach, I sort of had a little bit of difficulty fitting the research that I was doing into the public view, right? How do we get publics interested in this type of research, right? How do we sort of make it relatable, I suppose? And so while I was doing all this outreach, I also took a course in science communication that was really eye-opening for me. Ultimately, I ended up getting a second master's degree in life sciences communication and my PhD in mass communications. And I was studying sort of how we decide what information we choose and kind of how we process that information when it comes to science. And so, this really informs the type of research that I do, and therefore my comments on what a research agenda might look like, right? So I study public opinion dynamics. I think about the effects that media messages have on large groups of audiences, broadly writ, usually, and my work has primarily been based in the United States. I think about how they expose themselves or how they find these types of information, right? Using social psychological theories around cognitive dissonance, how we unconsciously engage in confirmation bias or defensive avoidance. And then I also think about how we process that information, how mental shortcuts or heuristics inform how we feel and inform our opinions and our attitudes and our perceptions. And then more recently, thinking about how emotion, affect, right, how we feel about something, the emotions that result from seeing a piece of information can influence our perceptions as well. And so, of course, all of this is through the lens of science, environment, and risk, and that's why we're here talking about this. And so if we look at the literature in the science of science communication, and what is called the science of science communication, there is no shortage of science comm research. Here are two flagship journals in this subdiscipline: Science Communication and Public Understanding of Science, right? Science communication has been around since 1979. Then it started in a different title. It's called Knowledge, Creation, Diffusion, Utilization. In 1994, it changed its name to Science Communication, probably partly as a response to Public Understanding of Science, which came about in 1992, right? And so we see a lot more interest in these topics. And so there is no shortage of science communication research, at least on applied science topics, right? So here you see a recent article about the COVID-19 pandemic. There are many articles about climate change, genetic testing, vaccinations, and one of my own about modifying the microbiome, right? This idea that one can modify it on your own. And so these are all applied science topics, and there's a lot of literature around there. I mean, relatively, right? I mean, not as much literature as there might be on a lot of other topics, but, you know, compared to basic science research, there's certainly a lot of research in science communication on applied topics. But the evidence base for basic science communication, for the communication of basic science, is limited. The landscape reports that Kathy referred to in her introduction, conducted by John Besley and colleagues and Todd Newman and colleagues, have found that, again, this is very limited. Less than 5% of the available research provides substantive evidence that speaks to the communication of basic science. And it doesn't even appear in the STEM journals, right? Which is not that surprising. So public engagement work and the research on public engagement often doesn't appear in science journals. And so we really lack this evidence base for knowing how to communicate about science, basic science. And so when we think about what a research agenda might look like, I want to talk about three sort of broad buckets of a research agenda, let's call it. So the first one is thinking about public perceptions of basic science. And we'll dive into each one of these in a little more detail in a moment, but I'll describe these buckets first. The second is around strategic goals and motivations. How do we decide what these are for basic science? And the final one is around communication and engagement training communicators. These could be scientists, these could be public information officers, right? These could be professional science communicators. What does this look like when it comes to basic science? And so thinking about the first one, public perceptions of basic science, there are a lot of questions that we could ask around here. A research agenda might investigate questions such as, what are public perceptions around basic science? We sort of have a sense of public perceptions around several applied topics. If I asked you, what do you think public perceptions around climate change are? It'd be pretty easy to answer that, right? Similarly, what values are there or are used in the formation of these opinions and perceptions around basic science issues? Again, if we go back to our thoughts about climate change, you'd probably be able to answer this question pretty easily if I asked it about climate, right? And then finally, how do these opinions or perceptions vary among different populations? This certainly isn't an exhaustive list of research questions to form a research agenda, but I think it is a good place to start. In our second bucket, thinking about strategic goals and motivations, I've sort of just divided this bucket further into two littler buckets, descriptive research questions and injunctive research questions. So here I'm thinking about what goals do people have, or what motivations do communicators have, versus what goals or strategies are effective, right? So we have our two big buckets. We have first descriptive research questions, like I've mentioned. What goals do communicators, such as scientists, have when communicating about basic science? What strategies are used in communicating basic science? And then the injunctive questions, right? What should or what could be used, I suppose. What goals are effective, right? So what should I use for communicating about basic science? And then what is the role of something like emotions in there? We've talked at the SciPep conference, hopefully you were in attendance. We've talked about the role of wonder and awe, right, in communicating basic sciences. And much more work needs to be done in these. These are certainly overlooked emotions in the literature. Our third bucket then is around communication and engagement training. Similarly, I've thought about descriptive research questions and injunctive ones. A descriptive question might look like what training programs already exist, right? So describing the landscape of what training programs and opportunities exist for communication and engagement with basic science. And then, of course, what should exist, right? What kinds of training opportunities should we have? Should they be different from training people to engage with other types of, or the more applied sciences? And of course, the one question that we've probably all been thinking here is that final thought, right? Does it matter whether we distinguish basic and applied science? And so I want to leave you, I think, with that slightly thought-provoking question. And I really look forward to the discussion in February.
Thank you, Sarah. That's a fantastic presentation. I like the organization and the way it sets up lots of good questions for discussion. Let's dig into some of those. Here's my first thought. When you raise that issue about emotions that support engagement or talk about science, about basic science, and emotions that might hinder or keep us from being interested or seeing ourselves as interested. And I'm thinking about, here I'm asking you to speculate, I guess. I'm thinking about best practices for teachers, for parents, for mentors. And one best practice that's commonly encouraged is open-ended questions, respectful open-ended questions. Tell me more, how did you get interested in that? Or, someone's looking at those interesting microbial surfaces you were studying and they ask, how does that happen? Or why is that? Or whatever. What are your thoughts about respectful open-ended questions as launch pads for identities that help us to see ourselves as interested in the natural and social world?
Yeah, I think this is a really great question. And our speakers at SciPep, Tanya Lombroso and Daniel Silva Luna, they work on wonder and awe, right? These ideas. And I do think this is, they seem like gateway emotions, right? To curiosity. I think I would hypothesize, I suppose, that there is a connection between wonder and awe and some type of curiosity. And I know there's a science curiosity scale where we can measure that, right? And I think this just adds to another research question, right? Does this measurable trait of science curiosity, does that matter, right, for how we communicate basic science? Is it different then from how we communicate with applied sciences? And, then there's the other side of that from the content producers. I was thinking about, well, what are these emotions, or how can we engage people to be more curious, perhaps? But then from the kind of receiver end, the learning versus, right, the learning part of this, how does learning happen? And I will admit that is a little bit outside of my realm of expertise, because I tend to study not so much learning effects over time, but persuasive effects. And so I think this is also part of the research question, right? And a research agenda. There's so much room, I think, in this research agenda that is understudied. And I wish I could give a better answer than this. But, the social scientist answer is always, it depends. And it certainly does. And in this case, it depends on us doing that research, I think, putting that in our research agenda.
Yeah, I'm just thinking about differences in identity. I guess I'm also thinking about your last question about, should we call it basic science? Because I'm thinking about people who would express curiosity and interest about the natural world and the social world,
yeah,
but might not express interest or curiosity or see themselves as
science people, perhaps.
Yeah. Who knows?
Yeah, who knows? Yeah, that's really interesting. And I think one thing that is important to keep in mind too is, I think for those science interested or science curious audiences, those who are already there, I think I suspect it might be easier to engage them in basic science than it would be for somebody who is not as science curious, right? Who maybe does not opt to go to a natural history museum or a science museum on the weekend. And so, I wonder about that. The other thing I wonder, which I have heard anecdotally, I have not read the literature myself, but I've heard secondhand from learning research friends, is that children can be a good means of reaching adults, right? I think often teaching children something at school can have downstream effects on their parents and the adults around them. And so I think there's an interesting question there about, because I suspect you're more likely to learn about basic science, right? In the younger ages. And so that seems like a ripe opportunity that I think we probably shouldn't overlook.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. Just incredibly and so important, your point about, how do we reach people who feel, for whatever reason, alienated from science, and might their engagement with the natural world or the social world be one gateway, one way of connecting with them. You also talked in your presentation about say groups of people out there, say, you yourself. I love learning about your own history, and your focus on the microbial environment and the basic science questions you asked in that role. So I guess maybe this is speculating, but you're designing a study in this research agenda. Who are some groups of scientists you want to do in-depth interviews with and maybe survey eventually, and who are some communication practitioners you want to do in-depth interviews and
so
survey?
I have to admit that I am doing a little bit of this work.
Cool.
So I have a research project on humor, generously funded by the National Science Foundation, but and when we started with a seed project at my university, at the University of Utah, studying a very basic science joke and the effect of this basic science joke, right? It was a joke about chemistry, or, one could look at it as physics, but when atoms lose electrons, they get more positive, right? Because they were losing their negative electrons. So there's a pun around there. So we showed this joke to audiences on Twitter, embedded in a tweet to our respondents in a survey experiment, and we got some results. We find that humor does increase people's intentions to engage with science further on down the line. All this to set up that my follow-up study is with more applied sciences. So I have climate change, microbiomes, and artificial intelligence, and you see differences. So for something like microbiomes or artificial intelligence, the effects of the humor are very similar to the basic science joke, but for climate change, it's not at all similar. And so this is just a single piece of evidence that there is, I think, something different and unique about basic versus applied sciences, or it could be that it's not necessarily about basic versus applied sciences. Instead, it's where the scientific issue is on the public agenda, right? What you and I as communication scholars know as the issue attention cycle. And so is basic science on the public agenda? Is it within that issue attention cycle? I'm not sure that it is, but maybe it's that factor versus it being basic or applied science that matters, right? And I think these are things we need to tease apart. And as to the question about interviewing scientists or communicators and then trainers as well, I know Karen, I'm gonna butcher her last name. I'm so sorry, Karen. Karen Andrade, maybe, who was a civic science fellow at the Rita Allen Foundation, had done some of this work and interviewed some trainers. And so I think that work is ongoing and underway. As to scientists, I am in the process of trying to survey scientists. Scientists, if you're watching, please take the survey. But trying to interview scientists for their thoughts on communication strategies and goals, right? And this runs the gamut from scientists who study climate change to scientists who are theoretical physicists. And so, hopefully I'll get some insight there. But I live in my own little research bubble, so I'm not sure of other work going on. But I do think this is a good start for trying to maybe get at the distinction
Mhm.
between basic and applied science. And if scientists can self-report, right, where they see themselves in this continuum of basic and applied science, or even if they use that continuum, I suspect that, at least on a daily basis, we don't think about it. But certainly if one were to engage with public audiences, it might bring to the fore whether your science is more applied or more basic, right?
Well, okay, and that so maybe this is really interesting. I'm excited to hear more about your research, Sarah. And you're opening up some great windows for me to keep learning about what's going on in this incredibly cool field of science communication. Um, Okay, I'm circling back to what the heck is basic science, and I know we explored that quite a bit this summer and in each of the prior video talks. But all right, so my version of basic science, the microbiome or whatever, and your version are not the same.
Yeah.
So in my quick off the top of my head notion, I'm thinking like, do we mean both? Do we mean, communicating to the child who asked, why did the stars twinkle? And the theoretical physicist who's going to, help us understand, or astrophysicist who's going to help us understand, like, who's basic science? Basic to me because I just
so this is
on it, or is it to the expert,
right. Yeah, thank you, Kathy, for bringing this up, because this is so important, right? Because you and I are scientists, but I know nothing. I'm not going to say that you know nothing, because I don't know, but I know nothing about why stars twinkle. You know what I mean? And so I am a public audience member for many domains of science. And so I think this idea of having different publics is really important, and recognizing different publics, because different publics, as a communicator, you should have different goals for different publics. Right, which means knowing a little bit about those publics. And so the research that informs the practice and vice versa is really important here. And so, I think, and I really hope in February, that we are able to have a deep conversation about definitions of basic and applied science. And I think, we could use those conversations in a lot of other domains around definitions and what specific definitions I'm using, because I think a lot of miscommunication occurs when my definition differs from your definition, perhaps.
Right. Maybe I think I keep coming, this is back to emotions, but I, for various reasons, I've been reading literature on identity. And I think, the whole culture is reading literature on, I'm thinking of Carol Dweck's work when Carol says that, someone self-defines as, oh, I can't do public speaking, or I can't do science, or I can't do fill in the blank. And the pedagogy that comes out of that research is to help us reframe it as, I am not a person who does, I wasn't genetically presented as someone who can or can't, but it's more a question of muscles I can develop over time, and coaching and social environments. So I wonder, maybe what are your questions about the social conditions that promote identity as someone who's curious about the natural world?
Maybe someone's science identity in that way. And it's so interesting, because I've just been looking at scales that measure science identity, and that are often associated with this idea of having fixed and essentialist mindsets as well. This idea that some of us, right, have a trait where we just tend to think that our abilities, or our learning abilities perhaps are set, right? At birth, essentially, versus I can continue to learn over the course of a lifetime. And so I think, and these are, there's no right or wrong here. It's just perceptions, right, that we hold. These are kind of traits of ourselves as part of our identity. And I see myself as someone who can either learn over my lifetime, or that my learning ability was set when I was when I was born, right? And so I think that has a lot to do with that. And I wonder, I don't know Carol's work very well, unfortunately. I apologize for that. But I wonder about how to, instead of changing science identity per se, thinking also in addition, right? We can work on science identity, and we can also work on how do we affect these fixed and essentialist mindsets, right? How do we reframe, like you say, not only I am a science person, but also I can continue learning, right? More sort of open-mindedness, so to speak, to continuing education, perhaps, or lifelong learning, right?
Yeah, and it may be just thinking with you about this a little bit. Well, again, coming back to that culture, how among differing groups, let's go with a group that feels alienated from science right now, whichever group it is, for whatever reason. If I'm talking with them, how do I enter? Do I go in as, your buddy who lives across the street and likes your children and thinks the snake that showed up in our backyard is kind of cool and we should talk about it? Or do I start talking about climate change, because I want to talk about that?
Yeah, so it's really interesting, and I like Dr. Nalini Nadkarni. She's a biologist here at the University of Utah. She does a great job with science engagement and outreach, and I always remember what she said. So she is a member of a church, and she says, when I go to church, I put my church hat on, but also we can talk about science, because sometimes I'll take my little church hat off and put my science hat on, my scientist hat on. And so there's, I think, opportunities, because we're not just academics or scientists. Like, I'm involved in communities, in my neighborhood, in my city, where I have a different identity, perhaps, and maybe can leverage that identity, for communication.
That's fantastic. This is a wonderful field of research. Thank you. I'm excited about what you find next.
Yes, thank you so much. I really look forward to our more conversation in February.
Thank you. Well, thank you, Sara. That was a fantastic conversation and talk, and I'm really looking forward to getting together live in February. Just remember, audience, that this is one of 3 spotlight videos in our session, Communicating the Future, an agenda for engaging the public with basic science. Our 3 panelists and I will come together in February for live discussion. Please check the AAAS Annual Meeting website for the panel's date and time. Again, thank you, Sara, and thank you, audience, for watching this video. We look forward to talking with you all live in February.
Thank you, Kathy.